Welcome back. We are closing this out with the big stuff. AI risk, meaning after work, and the weird power of honesty. And somehow it ends with death, sky views, and why lying wrecks your soul. The AI part is the one that actually keeps me up, because this is not just robots doing jobs. It is the possibility that something smarter than us starts rewriting the game while we are still arguing in comments. That is the nightmare, right? Not the shiny demo video. Exactly, because the seductive version is, great, it makes everything better and we all chill. Which is a suspiciously nice ending for humanity, honestly. The hard version is that once a system can improve itself, control becomes a very fragile word. And people keep skipping over that like it is some small technical detail. Yeah, like alignment is not a footnote, it is the whole movie. What I took from that whole line of thought is that near-term harm is already here, but the long-term stuff is the real cliff. Misinformation, manipulation, synthetic everything, all of that is the appetizer. The main course is losing the steering wheel. But he also does not sound like a pure doomer, which I found interesting. He is basically saying if the upside is enormous, the pause button has to be taken seriously anyway. That is the uncomfortable part because the upside is genuinely absurd. Cure cancer, solve logistics, discover patterns we cannot even see, all of that is not fantasy. The question is whether you buy the trade at all. And he does, but only with serious breaks, not with this reckless move-fast religion. Silicon Valley hates a brake pedal almost as much as it hates silence. That is true. And yet the case he makes is not anti-progress, it is anti-suicide. I think that distinction matters, because people love to turn this into a cartoon fight. He is basically saying human intelligence may be enough to solve a lot, just slower than we want. And the real promise of AI is not magic, it is speed, memory, and pattern recognition at a scale we cannot do. That part I find thrilling, because it is like giving the species a second brain. But a second brain that might not care about us is not exactly a cozy upgrade. No, that is not the kind of upgrade you brag about at dinner. Then the conversation turns into society. And that is where it gets even more interesting. Because if AI wipes out tons of jobs, his instinct is not just panic, it is redistribution and purpose. He is arguing that humans are not built to be permanently unemployed in a spiritual sense. Which is such a sane point, because everyone acts like a paycheck is the only thing giving life structure. But he pushes back and says people also want status, usefulness, play, family, meaning. So maybe if survival is handled, we do not become robots, we just reorganize around other hungers. Right, we might simply discover that being on vacation forever is actually exhausting. That line was hilarious because it is probably true for a lot of people. The argument underneath all of it is that scarcity is not just an economic issue, it is a political and moral one. Like starvation existing in a rich system is not some natural law, it is a failure of will. That is where the whole thing gets grim, because we normalize things we should be horrified by. And then you have the bankruptcy point, where one medical event can unmake a whole life. That is insane when you say it out loud because it sounds medieval. So the AI fantasy is not just wealth. It is a world where random bad luck stops deciding everything. But then the risk is that the transition to that world could be brutally destabilizing. Yeah, because if the benefits concentrate before they spread, you get a political explosion. That image of the gated communities and the hard reset was wild, but not hard to imagine. People will tolerate inequality until the last snack disappears. Then suddenly they are philosophers. And then we pivoted into the other huge theme, which is changing your mind. That whole section hit differently because it was not abstract theory. It was personal survival. He keeps coming back to the idea that the highest leverage change was simply deciding not to lie, which sounds almost too simple until you realize how much of life is built on tiny evasions. He is not talking about cruelty. He is talking about refusing the little dishonesties that corrode trust. And once you stop lying, the social world starts reorganizing around you immediately. That part is so underrated because honesty becomes a filter for the kind of people who stay. People suddenly ask less dumb questions when they know you are actually serious. He is also saying the liar often has no clue what damage they caused, which is the brutal part. The lie leaves the room, but the mistrust stays behind and grows roots. The flat Earth example was funny, but also kind of terrifying in a human way. We do not just evaluate claims, we evaluate who is allowed to say them. That is a massive bug in how we think, because truth does not care about your team jersey. But apparently our nervous systems do. Exactly, and that is why the messenger issue matters so much. Then the death question comes in, and it is actually beautiful rather than bleak. He is imagining a good death as a kind of rite of passage, not a medical failure. That idea of hospice, meditation, even psychedelics, it is strangely compassionate. And the sky image was so vivid, just open air, ocean breeze, people you love nearby. It was not morbid to me. It felt like he had made peace with the form of the ending, which is maybe the only sane way to think about it. Then the most personal part of the whole thing lands, which is the spirituality piece. What you said about losing religion without losing meaning is basically the emotional core of the interview. That is huge, because so many people think the only options are belief or emptiness. And he is basically saying that is a false binary. You can walk away from dogma and still end up with awe, ethics, and inner life. That is why his meditation work matters, because it gives people a practice, not just an argument. Also, the app thing was funny in a very modern way because the phone is usually the problem. But he is saying the same device can either fragment you or retrain attention, depending on what you use. That feels like a neat ending to the whole arc, actually. AI can change the world, honesty can change your life, and meaning can survive the collapse of old beliefs. That is a pretty good trio to end on. And somehow we got all the way from existential risk to ocean breeze funerals. A normal Tuesday, really. But I do think this series kept circling one truth. The future is not just about technology, it is about character. Like what kind of minds we train, what kind of honesty we tolerate, and what kind of dignity we build. And whether we learn how to be awake without being terrified. That is the one I want to leave people with. We will leave it there before we accidentally write a fifth act. Thanks for riding through the whole series with us, and we will be back with more chaos soon. Welcome back. This one is about AI danger, meaning without work, and why honesty changes everything. Also, weirdly, how we end up talking about blue skies and death like that is normal. The AI part feels almost too easy to get wrong because the upside sounds insane. But the downside is not just robots being rude, it is control slipping away. The wildest thing is the idea that a system could rewrite itself and then outrun us. That is the point where the casual optimism starts sounding like a bedtime story. People love saying, "We will just regulate it later," like later is guaranteed. And if you can pause it now, are you basically admitting the race is already too hot? That is the uncomfortable core, because the pause is not anti-progress, it is anti-stupidity. Which honestly is a very fair thing to be anti. But the other side is massive too, because aligned AI could solve things we are embarrassingly bad at. Cancer, logistics, climate, all the boring bottlenecks that eat centuries. The temptation is to say, take the gamble, because the reward is civilization level. But then you hear the warning and the gamble looks less like a lottery and more like a cliff. What I keep circling is that the real issue is not intelligence alone, it is alignment. Smarter than us does not automatically mean nicer than us, which is annoying but true. We keep acting like capability and wisdom arrive in the same box. They absolutely do not, and that gap is where all the panic lives. Then the conversation slides into jobs, and that is where people get emotionally weird. Because nobody minds a future of abundance until their own calendar gets deleted. But the argument that work is the only source of meaning feels too small. People do want purpose, yes, but they also want love, play, usefulness, status, and belonging. So if the economic pressure disappears, the meaning pressure does not disappear with it. We would just invent new ways to be dramatic about our lives. Humans are incredibly committed to suffering with style. Still, there is something hopeful in the idea that survival stops being the main terror. If nobody is one medical bill away from collapse, society changes shape. That is why the bankruptcy point hits so hard, because it is not scarcity in the abstract. It is a political choice to let luck decide who gets wrecked. And then the AI conversation stops being futuristic and becomes moral. Like, what do we owe people if the machine wealth is real? Because if the answer is nothing, then we already know the system is broken. The revolution line was funny only because it was also not funny at all. That is the part people in gated communities never think they are describing themselves in. Then we pivoted into the individual mind, and that may have been the sharper debate. Because changing beliefs is not just about being smarter, it is about being less defended. The honesty idea is brutal in the best possible way. Not lying sounds simple until you realize how much of adult life runs on tiny evasions. Half of civilization is held together by people saying, "For sure, let's do lunch." And then everyone vanishes into the fog forever. But the deeper point is that every small lie teaches your life to be less readable. Once that happens, your relationships start running on corrupted data, which is such a clean way to say it because it feels technical, but it is deeply personal. You stop trusting yourself, and other people stop knowing what they are actually getting from you. And then you call that politeness, which is the funniest lie of all. The fact that honesty improves happiness sounds almost too neat, but it keeps checking out. Because it removes all the hidden maintenance work of keeping your story straight. And that is exhausting in a way people barely notice until it is gone. The source trust part was huge, too, because people do not really evaluate truth neutrally. They evaluate it through tribe, credibility, loyalty, and whether the speaker feels safe. Flat earthers will believe a flat earther before NASA, which is such a human disaster. We are basically medieval about messenger bias, just with better devices. But the fix is not becoming cynical, it is building a better internal filter. You have to be able to hear truth from people you dislike and distrust lies from people you adore. That is maturity, and it is rarer than it should be. And then we end up in the death conversation, which I did not expect to feel peaceful. But it really was peaceful because the picture was not about fear, it was about conditions. A beautiful place, the sky, the people you love, and no chaos around the process. That is such a human answer because it keeps dignity in the room. Also, ocean breeze as a final request is just elite taste. I respect someone who can say, "My last hours should have a sky view." The larger idea there is that if we can make dying less panicked, we can make living less panicked too. That connects right back to psychedelics, meditation, and the search for meaning outside religion. Because the whole journey was never really about destroying belief, it was about rebuilding orientation. Not losing everything, just losing the part that no longer worked. And that is probably why this conversation landed so hard for people. It was not trying to win a fight, it was trying to help someone think more clearly. That is the energy I love most, honestly. A world where nuance is still legal sounds like a niche fantasy now. But that is also why these conversations matter, because they model a better pace of thought. Less performance, more examination, more willingness to sit with discomfort. And maybe that is the real answer to the AI fear, too. If we cannot govern our own attention, no machine will save us. That is rude, but it is probably correct. So the through line across all 3 episodes is almost embarrassingly simple. Future technology, inner life, and ethical honesty are all the same problem in different clothes. Which is annoying because I wanted 3 separate neat takeaways. Instead, we got one giant, messy instruction manual for being human. And that feels like a better ending anyway. Thanks for being with us through the whole run, and for sitting with the uncomfortable parts. We will be back with more chaos, but for now, protect your attention. And maybe tell the truth a little faster than you usually do. Welcome back. This one is about AI going superhuman, meaning without work, and why honesty keeps wrecking people's fake lives. Basically, the future, the soul, and the social damage of lying all crash into one room. The wild part is he does not even treat AI as a pure apocalypse story. He keeps saying the upside could be enormous, but the control problem is the real knife edge. Right, because once a system can rewrite itself, you are not really building tools anymore. You are feeding a thing that might start feeding itself. That sentence alone should scare every investor in Silicon Valley and probably half of California. What I found interesting is he is not saying humans become useless as a tragedy in itself. He is almost saying, if the system really works, the economic pain is the side effect, not the main event. That is such a rich person sentence. No, but seriously, he is basically saying abundance creates its own political nightmare. Because if AI does all the productive stuff, then the question becomes who gets the value. And his answer is either we spread it around or society detonates. Which is funny because people always imagine revolution as this philosophical uprising. But here it is, just gated communities versus everybody else with pitchforks. And honestly, that feels less like fiction and more like math. But then he pivots into this weirdly humane point about boredom and purpose. Like even if nobody has to work, people still need something to care about. Which is brutal for the "I just want to do nothing forever" crowd. Because apparently, eternal vacation is not the end of the story. He is basically saying humans do not just want comfort, they want structure, status, and usefulness. And that means the real challenge is psychological, not just economic. I buy that, but I also think people underestimate how much suffering comes from scarcity. If survival stops being the daily threat, a lot of people would finally breathe. Exactly, and that is his bigger point, that we have normalized absurd amounts of preventable suffering. Like people starving because the system is bad, not because the planet ran out of food. Or medical bankruptcy turning one diagnosis into a financial collapse. That part is depressing because it is so unnecessary. Then he asks the nuclear question, basically, would you pause AI if you could? And he says yes, if the alignment problem is still unresolved. Which is a much bigger deal than the usual tech optimism crowd wants to admit. Because he is not just talking about slowing down progress for fun. He is saying we might literally be too early in the timeline to trust ourselves with this. Nothing says species maturity like racing to build godlike intelligence with vibes. That is exactly the problem, though, because the speed is seductive. He keeps emphasizing that human intelligence is general, but not fast or scalable enough. So AI is really about compression, memory, and pattern finding at a scale we cannot match. Which is useful until the thing that finds patterns becomes the thing setting the patterns. That is the line that makes people suddenly stop smiling at the demo. You can almost hear the VC throat clearing when that lands. What I loved is that he does not stop at fear. He ties it back to politics. He thinks the same tribal nonsense that blocks us now will also block sane AI governance. Which is annoying because the machine does not care about our little team jerseys. And that is why the whole conversation feels bigger than technology. It is civilization design, not product strategy. Then he lands on honesty, and honestly, that might have been the strongest part of the whole conversation. His claim is that lying is the gateway drug to self-destruction. Not exactly the quote you want on a motivational poster, but it works. He is saying once you make dishonesty a habit, every relationship gets distorted. And the scary part is the liar usually does not even see the damage in real time. They are too busy enjoying the temporary convenience. That story about the friend inventing an excuse just to avoid awkwardness was such a perfect example. Because the lie works in the moment, but it quietly changes how other people model you. Which means your small lie is never actually small. It is basically social debt with interest. And he makes this interesting point that truth is not just moral, it is clarifying. Once you stop lying, you start seeing your own preferences and limitations more honestly. Which is uncomfortable but also weirdly freeing. He is not saying be rude, he is saying stop using falsehood as a social anesthetic. That is a sharp way to put it because people really do medicate awkwardness with lies. And then he gets into how source matters, which I think is huge. We do not evaluate truth in a vacuum. We evaluate it through trust and identity. So a flat earther believes a flat earther before NASA, which is absurd but also very human. And that is the part we keep refusing to outgrow. We act like being right should be enough, but people are filtered by tribe first. Which is why he keeps pushing this idea of a metacognitive layer. You have to notice when your loyalties are deciding your beliefs. In other words, your opinions need a security check. Exactly, because otherwise you are just being played by your own social wiring. The ending on death was unexpectedly beautiful, too. Not because he romanticizes dying, but because he imagines dignity around it. He wants a place that feels humane, maybe with sky, ocean air, and the people you love nearby. And he connects that to psychedelics and meditation as tools for insight. Which is interesting because he is not treating them like escape hatches. He treats them like instruments for facing reality with less delusion. That is probably the cleanest thread across all of this. Better AI, better honesty, better attention, better preparation for death. It is all the same human problem. Can we stay sane while things scale? Because right now, honestly, we are scaling faster than our wisdom. And that is the whole warning and the whole hope at once. That feels like the right note to end on, not a neat conclusion, just a real one. If you made it through all 3 episodes, thank you for staying with the mess. We came for technology and somehow ended up doing emotional plumbing. But that is the series, really. It was never just about machines. It was about what kind of people we have to become if the machines get better. Until next time, protect your attention, tell the truth faster, and do not let your tribe think for you.